A worrying, even dangerous trend emerging in the East African region. A trend where leaders increasingly speak about dissent not as something to engage, but something to suppress. This week, Tanzanian leader Samia Suluhu Hassan said of activists that, and I quote, "Atawapiga mikwaju," that they would be beaten.
You see, as a Kenyan, I've always believed in this issue of if you want to really do away with the economy or the development of a nation, then make sure that you really deal with the education thoroughly. And I think that is one of the things. That is one of the things that William Ruto and his government are really working so hard to ensure that they deal with education like they kill the education sector. For any country to develop, there must be that issue of there must be people who are going to school to get knowledge and to be taught. But then you realize that that is one of the things that is being fought in this country by almost everybody. Now, yesterday night, during the news gang between Yvon, Okwara, Kai, Sam Gituku, Bonyo and Jamila, there is a statement that was made by Jamila. And this statement was linking the government with the education.
Earlier this year, Kenya witnessed the first transition of students into grade 10 under the competency-based education system. The government promised a 100% transition. And when challenges emerged, like lack of fees, shortage of spaces, students being placed in schools they did not choose, some schools receiving no learners at all while others overflowed, the response from education officials was swift and reassuring. Parents were told, take your children to school. No fees, no problem. No uniforms, still no problem. Government, they said, would handle the rest. And for a moment, there was relief. We visited Mukuru Kwanjenga slum in Nairobi during that period and met families that had almost lost hope. Children stranded at home simply because their parents could not afford school fees.
Indeed, you have a big heart. May the Lord bless you. Leo mmenisaidia mtoto wangu anaenda shule. May the Lord bless you.
That was when the government gave reassurance and education officials promised everything had been sorted out. There were smiles, relief, tears, excitement. Finally, these children would continue with school. Except now, 3 months later, it appears everything may only have lasted a few days. Because what is now emerging is deeply disturbing. Learners who had supposedly been placed in schools were quietly sent home shortly after reporting. Schools saying they never received any government funding. There was no commitment, there was no arrangement, not even a follow-up call. And suddenly that proudly announced 100% transition is beginning to sound less like an education success story and more like a motivational speech. Apparently the transition worked perfectly until the schools started asking who was actually going to pay for it. And this is where the conversation stops being about policy and starts becoming about honesty. Because if the government knew there was no clear plan, there was no funding and no capacity to sustain those learners, then why make promises for desperate parents and children in the first place? Why give children hope only to withdraw it a few weeks later? There's something especially painful about lying to children. Children believe. They trust. Children hear government officials on television and assume adults are telling the truth.
Girls, tukapatiwa uniform, tukapigwa picha na yeye. Niliondoka, tukaambiwa uniform hajalipiwa na tukafukuzwa hajalipa pesa. Tuka sana sita na tulifukuzwa na tujairudi.
So when a child reports to school believing their future has finally opened up, only to quietly return home days later, what exactly are we teaching them about leadership, about institutions, and about honesty? And the worrying part is this. In less than 6 months, another group of students will sit exams hoping to transition smoothly into grade 10. Yet from everything we are seeing, there still appears to be no sustainable plan. And this is happening in a country where enormous time, money, and energy are being constantly spent elsewhere on politics, mobilization, empowerment programs, campaigns. But surely education itself is empowerment. Keeping a child in school should be among the highest priorities of any serious government. In fact, we seem to have mastered the art of launching things before figuring out how they will actually work. And that is why we ask again, what exactly has happened to our leadership's priorities? Because if there is nothing to offer, then perhaps silence is better than promises that cannot be sustained. You see, disappointing adults is one thing, but lying to children, that is something else entirely. And that is my memo.
And also, Yvon Okwara also mentioned something to do with remember when William Ruto was in Tanzania the other day, and Mama Samia Suluhu was telling him that he should find a way of dealing with the Gen Zs. Like he should fight and should beat them. Kaka is talking about the Supreme Court, and Sam Gituku is also talking about government to government, a project. But then, I want us to have this in mind, or literally, I want us to think deep. I want us to ask ourselves, what is going on?
A worrying, even dangerous trend emerging in the East African region. A trend where leaders increasingly speak about dissent not as something to engage, but something to suppress. This week, Tanzanian leader Samia Suluhu Hassan said of activists that, and I quote, "atawapiga mikwaju," that they would be beaten. The remarks came in reference to the wave of activism sweeping across the region, during which activists, including Kenyans and Ugandans, have recently been detained and mistreated in Tanzania. And it is not unfamiliar language. Here in Kenya, during the Gen Z protests, President William Ruto repeatedly framed young protesters as children in need of discipline. There were calls for respect for elders, a tone that suggested dissent was not democratic participation, but disobedience. Not to mention President Museveni, who also gives what are seemingly polite lectures to his bazukulu, or it reinforces same hierarchy. Leader as the elder, citizen as the child, and once citizens are reduced to children, dissent becomes disrespect. Criticism becomes disobedience. And all of these must be punished. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the problem. Because increasingly, young citizens are being infantilized whenever they question authority. They are treated as children who need discipline, children who need punishment, children who must be corrected, sometimes brutally. But strangely, these same children are still expected to pay taxes, build the economy, carry the burden of the nation, and finance the very governments silencing them. You see, you cannot demand citizenship responsibilities from people while denying them the dignity of citizenship itself. Presidents are not leading a country of inferior beings who can never speak or question. They're not leading children who must only be seen and never heard, like in the ancient days of tyrannical fathers with loud booming voices where wives and children scattered into silence the moment he walked through the door. That is not democracy. That is fear. And fear is not leadership. Presidents are leading a country of equals, a country of citizens, not slaves. Slavery was abolished centuries ago, by the way. Citizens are not whipped into obedience. They are engaged. They are persuaded. They are listened to. Because presidents are not slave masters. They are public servants, employed by the people. And perhaps somewhere along the way, let me address them directly now, You, the leaders, have confused authority with ownership. You speak as though citizens exist for the comfort of the state. But in truth, the state exists for the people, not above them, not beyond them, and certainly not against them. Leadership is not about forcing people into silence. It's about bringing people together. Often, people with different views, different frustrations, different ideas of how to build a country. That is your assignment. And yes, sometimes that means criticism, sometimes anger, and sometimes dissent. That is not insubordination. That is democracy. In fact, you know what is truly insubordinate? It's when leaders forget who employs them. When they torture citizens, when they threaten them, when they beat them for speaking up. Because presidents are leaders with an L, not beaters with a B. And if the instinct is to beat people into submission, to whip them into silence, to punish every opposing voice, then perhaps the presidency is the wrong job for you. Because leadership is not about domination. It's about service. It's about walking with citizens towards a common goal. Not the leader's goal, but a national one, a shared one. And that is my take tonight.
The second president of Kenya, the late Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi, used to compare Kenyans to a chicken which, having had its feet tied all the way from the market, cannot walk on reaching the homestead until it is kicked or chased away. Sometimes I feel Moi was dead accurate. When it comes to the relationship between Kenyans and the Constitution of Kenya 2010, we are indeed like that chicken. Yes, the chicken in us has never quite appreciated the gravity of the first article of that post-tied chicken feet constitution, an article that expressly offers that, quote, all sovereign power belongs to the people of Kenya, end of quote. Oblivious of the tied chicken feet mindset, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 proceeded to create 12 independent constitutional institutions. This includes 10 independent commissions and 2 independent offices. Watching some of these institutions at work sometimes, and unfortunately, reminds one of Moi's chicken analogy. If it should come as relief for the Judicial Service Commission, JSC, last week's interview of candidates for the Supreme Court and eventual nomination of the judge was no tied chicken stuff. The televised interviews saw commissioners conducting themselves professionally, asking all questions, including the uncomfortable questions, and generally conducting a transparent process before live television cameras. The outcome, too, acquitted the process well. For any fair viewer watching the live interviews, Justice Mohamed Warsame was by far the best candidate and the most prepared to be the next judge of the Supreme Court. At some point in the interview, a commissioner wondered aloud whether Warsame was interviewing for Chief Justice and not judge. Well, merit, unlike beauty, is not in the eyes of the beholder. Merit is self-evident. Merit also thrives in open spaces, and in such a televised open interview, it could not possibly escape the notice of any fair judge, commissioner, or layman that Justice Warsame was the man for the job. For the JSC, take it from the quality of air out there, it went well. This is a Supreme Court appointment free of any undertones, especially of the damaging political kind. There was none of that smell of sulfur that sometimes attends to such appointments. Candidates were interviewed openly, and the best qualified judicial officer was simply picked for the job. Now, the Judicial Service Commission, JSC, must build on its own lessons. The key one being there should be no substitute to merit when it comes to appointment of judges. The Supreme Court of Kenya has sometimes been pointed or painted as a political hotbed, yet it should not be. With only 7 positions in a country of 45 plus tribes and 47 counties, that bench had better be populated with sound minds that care for the geographical entity called Kenya in its entirety. It is indeed very painful when Supreme Court interviews are sometimes seen from the simplistic point of how a judge would vote in a presidential election petition alone. And then there is ethnicity that is thrown in there, and then perceived political connections and the likes. There's something really unfair about such viewpoints, especially on innocent candidates. Ultimately, the JSC must embrace its independence and aim to make the Supreme Court a 100% merit-based institution. Presidential election petitions is only one of several weighty duties the Supreme Court performs. Those judges have more work than just deciding who won or lost the election. They have a lot of work in between elections, including giving advisory opinions on impossible things, like how to review constituency boundaries years after missing the deadline. So to JSC, please, let the Supreme Court remain supreme. That is my kicker.
2 weeks now, the country has been embroiled in a debate about statistics released by the government statistician, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, that the country grew at a declining rate of 4.6%. And here, many have had an opinion, from disputing the figures and the interpretation by media outlets to using the data to conveniently shape narratives. But then, what's at stake? Let me begin with the size of the economy. The recently transmitted budget estimates for 2026-2027 financial year suggest that the economy is now at more than 20.8 trillion shillings in size. And this figure is important because it is based on it that several factors are measured. One of them is the budget deficit to GDP ratio. This is a metric the government uses to make a case for increased borrowing. It is calculated by taking the budget gap or deficit and dividing it by the GDP. If the GDP is higher, you have a more appealing rate. And then there is the public debt to GDP ratio, which I will shortly illustrate. Now, the National Treasury imagines that the country's GDP for purposes of the national budget is 20.8 trillion shillings. But the National Bureau of Statistics just put it at 17.6 trillion shillings. That is a difference of 3 trillion shillings. You see, the law requires the government to lower the ratio of public debt to GDP to 55% by mid-2028. Where are we now? At a debt estimate of 12.6 trillion shillings, this is 71.5% of the GDP based on the KNBS data. If the same debt figure is matched against the GDP of 20.8 trillion shillings, as per the National Treasury, figure shows. And when the National Treasury continues to pile up the debt with more expenditure and deficits declared, what is the plan? Secondly, when a government invests taxpayers' money to a government agency to count, where do politicians find the strength to generate their own contrarian data? Simple things like counting how many bags of maize were produced in a year. Why should it be a source of arguments? Yet, in the spirit of learning how to count what we want, the Ministry of Education shows up a Monday morning with an expression of shock that certain senior schools are charging fees beyond the guidelines. A very innocent shock when schools have been doing it for years. And then you learn that in every school board, the ministry is represented in the hierarchy of leadership down to the sub-county level. But let's be shocked and absorb it then order for an investigation. A counting nation that has no idea how much it costs to educate a Kenyan child from early childhood to higher education. How school capitation is an official figure, but not necessarily to be followed. How nobody knows how much money out of the declared capitation per learner effectively makes it to schools. And while students strive to learn statistics better than the adults, the counting problems evolves in the health sector. Simple measurements as how many of us are registered under the Social Health Authority. When figures of 30 million subscribers are announced by those in government, only for the Statistics Bureau to report that 20.9 million were registered based on their source. Who is the source, you may ask? The Social Health Authority. But then registration continues, and so does the counting. And so there is a pattern. Exaggerate the numbers, be it textbooks distributed to schools, money released to schools, money paid to hospitals, and whatever else sounds good. But when the control of budget or the Auditor General reports that certain institutions spent more money outside budget or on non-priority areas, every politician jilted by such must discount the figures and assign names, from sponsored headlines to terming them unverified figures to politicization of government expenditure and more. Perhaps the country needs an urgent meeting. We could call it National Conference on National Statistics. But then, shall we agree on how many people should attend? Because for public discourse to regain its credibility, a country must be spot on with data. Different sources can have different figures. The value is in the verifiability of such data and formula used. If we cannot speak to same issues with credible data, maybe there is no sense to cite figures, because then it becomes just a game, an exchange over who is right or wrong, a fact-checker game, and therein we lose the value that data brings to decision-making. That's my sense tonight.
Yeah.
And then it being brought out in this way, very publicly, you know, this is obviously one in a series of diplomatic gaffes, but, you know, what did this one particularly say to you? Because this was now two leaders, you know, one leader reprimanding another, both in private, from what, you know, President Samia said, and, you know, publicly.
Yeah, I think that one of the first things that comes to mind, Yvonne, was what was the hurry in President William Ruto making this arrangement about Tanga without the Tanzanian president being involved, okay? That's one. And having done it the way they did, why not inform her? That because if she spoke about it publicly from a private meeting that they had, it must have been something about Ilimkera. Because, Yvonne, we need to remember that there is a diplomatic problem here. Because in diplomacy and how you deal with a neighboring country and how you deal with matters, there's a process. There's consultation. There's protocol. Yeah, you just do not publicly announce a major infrastructure problem in another sovereign country before that country's leadership has actually owned and had that announcement. In fact, it should have been good if she's the one who would have announced it and said, well, we're coming into this agreement with Kenya here in Tanga, in Tanzania.
Kenya, Uganda, they all come here.
The whole will come here and they make that whole announcement.
As the host of this refinery.
As the host of this refinery. Yeah. Because even if the idea is good, Yvonne, the sequencing and the announcement and the lack of not following the process can damage the message. I mean, regional cooperation is amazing. The fact that Kenya and Tanzania, we need each other. We are neighbors. We are trading partners. And a refinery, if properly structured, properly built, could be very important for regional business, for regional energy security. But diplomacy should have been done the right way, should have been done at the right time, should have been done respecting the host country's processes, because what this visit exposed, Yvonne, as you said, diplomatic gaffes. This is not the first one. In fact, sometimes it comes across as too casual with protocol, comes across as bold and fast and too ambitious. Kuna haraka gani? Tuangalie to the past year. The latest one was what he said about Nigeria's English. Because when a president speaks it, kuna tofauti fulani na let's say Yvonne ukienda kwa kusema kizungu chao sio kizuri kama chetu. So when the president speaks about Nigeria's English in public, of course there'll be backlash. He tried to manage it and said ni mashemeji, but the damage had already been done. And then just recently, kuna neno Sam umejifunza siku karibu neno la Kiswahili. Kutufanya nini? Dogosha.
Ungetumia kalamu. Jamila, tafadhali. As you speak to tumia kalamu.
Jamila, usidogoshe.
Usitogoshe.
Ilo neno lilitumika. That word was used because of what President William Ruto said about the East African countries. And talking about how sisi wenyewe tuko like we are more tumeendelea zaidi ya mataifa mengine ya Afrika Mashariki, and that elicited a comment.
Roads, wasn't it?
Roads, yeah, and the kilometers and all that. And that elicited a reaction from the minister wa ujenzi wa kule Tanzania akisema waache kutudogosha, waache kutudhalilisha, stop bringing us down. That was just in the past couple of months. Let's not forget that just soon after President William Ruto was sworn in as president, there was a tweet that was baadaye deleted about the Republic of Sahrawi and our relationships with them. That was so early. Hizo tu ni zile ambazo nakumbuka saizi. Diplomatic gaffes, Yvon, and what that says about what the president speaks about when he's speaking in those platforms, whether locally or internationally, and what the implication is, because there are implications to this. Kama ya Sahrawi ilikuwa kubwa, ilibidi treaty futwe, but the damage had already been done. So kuna damage fulani na si ati inapotea, haipotei. So what does this style of diplomacy do? Does it open doors, or does it shut them completely, or does it raise questions about how we view other countries and their policies and their independence and their democracy and their processes and how you do things? So I really hope and pray that this is the last diplomatic gaffe that we see, because the president's words carry weight, as I said. When he speaks, our neighbors listen. When he speaks, the markets listen. When he speaks, Kenyans listen. When he speaks, diplomats listen. When he speaks, it's wisdom fulani. So a casual comment can actually turn into a big regional incident. And I think it's important that this Tanga gaffe should be a lesson on how to behave going forward when it comes to issues that are not yet hapa nchini. Hapa nchini tunakuwa na zetu, tunasema tunajibu kila kitu. That's different. But then ukivuka mipaka inapasa kuwa tofauti kidogo.